welcome back to the MTG Deck Tech's Guilds of Ravnica set review with Sean. Today we're going to be looking at Selesnya, the token-producing green-white deck that likes to get large board states, stall the opponents out, and then overwhelm them with advantage through Convoke. Our grading skill we're going to use today is A for our bombs, the cards that are going to win you the most games, the ones you're most excited to draw. You won't get many of them in your pool. B is your tilting point if you're trying to decide on a color or looking for solid removal. If you have multiple Bs in your deck, you feel really good about it. Your Cs are the cards that are most consistent. They make your cut. Your deck looks like it's regularly doing the same thing, but they're also not incredibly exciting. And your D cards are really going to have two categories. They're the cards that fill in the gaps where you're missing Cs. You're not really excited to have them. You would love to have a deck with 0 Ds in them. But it's also cards that you might build around that would be bad in most shells. But if you can put the right pieces together, such as a combo state, it's actually pretty decent. Whereas your F rating would be any cards that you build around and are still bad, cards that are bad on their own, or cards that are specifically sideboard cards and do not have much main deck application, such as cards like Naturalize in a non-artifact enchantment set. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start every time with a card that has a keyword from that guild in it. So in this one we have March of the Multitudes. This is X, green, white, white, so it's a lot like Sphinx's Revelation cast, and it's an instant. It has Convoke, so you can tap creatures to reduce the cost of the spell by 1, and if that creature shares a color with the cost of mana cost, you can use it towards the color instead. So if I tap my Merfolk Branchwalker, it can actually produce a green for the casting cost, or it can produce 1 for the X. This card creates X 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink at instant speed. In Limited, this card can make you a really wide board state, because in the Selesnya guild, we're trying to make a lot of creatures through Convokes and the couple token makers. So we're really trying to go as wide as possible, so when we have these big Convoke payoffs, we're actually able to maximize them for value. This card I give a B-, because if we're playing a mirror match or another deck that goes really wide, such as Golgari, then we're going to have a lot of problems as far as letting these 1/1s actually push damage through. So they're going to be make a bunch of 1/1s, they're not going to have a lot of purpose. But there's some matches where you're able to make enough 1/1s to go wide and punish your opponent, and the Life Leak helps you swing the matchups. Tristana the Discordant is a 3 green and a white, and it's a 1/4. She's Legendary Dryad. We've seen her in the last Ravnica set. When she comes into play, she creates 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with a lifelink. And at the beginning of each instep, you gain control of all creatures that you own. So that means if somebody steals one of your creatures, you get to take it back. There's only a couple cards in the format that it actually has an impact on. But the primary play with her in Limited is that she gives your other creatures +1/+1. So for 5 mana, you get to create a 1/4 and 2 2/2s that also pump the rest of your board. So this card's going to be a really important wall for other aggressive matchups like Boros. And as you go wide in a Selesnya list, if you have this card in your pool, it's going to help you turn the corner, because now your creatures start to be really unfair casting costs towards power ratios. For Limited, I give her a B+, because of the power that she comes in with. She's technically coming in with 5 power and 9 toughness whenever you combine the tokens in her base level, not counting any pumps she does to other creatures. So she's definitely a card you want to see in your pool. Amara, Soul of the Accord, is a 2 mana 2/2. When she becomes tapped, you create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink, and she's legendary. So for her, you're going to have a Grizzly Bear. You might attack with her a few times, but really you're going to try to use her for convoking throughout the rest of the game and creating a bunch of free 1/1s every time you convoke, because you tap her to go towards the cost of a spell, so it adds up really efficiently. She's a C+. She's not going to really win you a bunch of games on her own, but she's going to give you the value so your Bs and A cards are actually able to make that push. Conclave Guildmage is a 2 mana 2/2, so another Grizzly Bear, and it has green tap. Creatures you control gain trample until the end of turn. This can be good for breaking board stalls, because Selesnya is designed not to have a lot of large creatures, but to go really wide. So that trample effect is going to be really important to swing a board stall in your favor. And it has 6 mana, tap it, create a 2/2 green and white elf knight creature token with vigilance. So it slowly is able to develop more board states as the game goes longer, and it stalls out. And also those elves can be used to convoke spells as well. It gets a C+ because of its ability to win the long game, because Selesnya wants to live in the long game. Its card as alone is not incredibly impressive, but with what the Selesnya game plan is, it's really efficient. Assure and a Symbol. Assure is a 2 mana, put a 1/1 counter on a creature you control, and that gains indestructible to dodge certain removal spells. Or a 6 mana instant, you create 3 2/2 green and white elf knight creature tokens with vigilance. Both sides of this card are decent to blank a removal spell or to make 6 powered instant speed. I give the card a C. The symbol aspect is really good, but I want my token producers to make 1 or 2 tokens earlier in the game so I can use them for convoking as opposed to later. So this card's a great ambush card, really good at throwing off combat math or being able to crack back for a lot of damage. The card very well could be a B, but because it doesn't really interact with my opponent's board state as much, it's not exactly what I want to get out of the larger mana cost. Conclave Cavalier is double green, double white, and it's a 4/4 Vigilance, which is a really strong body. The mana color is a little bit difficult. When it dies, you get 2/2 green, white, elf knight creature tokens with Vigilance. This card gets a B- just because of its sheer value. For 4 mana, you're basically getting out 8 power across the time it exists or when it dies. So it's a good investment. If it dies, you now have 2 bodies to convoke with. You've also gone a little bit wider, which is what you want to do in the later game of Selesnya. You want a wide board state. So in the early game, you play this, you pressure the opponent, you trade, then you go wide, which is where Selesnya wants to win the game. Selesnya Locket. It is the 3 mana artifact that produces mana, taps for a green or a white. You can pay 4 hybrid colored green or white mana and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. For Selesnya, I give their Locket a B+. Some of the Lockets I'm giving B- or Bs to, but because this has a lot of X spells or expensive Convoke cards, I really want to see the Selesnya Locket in my pool whenever I'm playing Selesnya, where it's not as important in Boros. Additionally, with Convoke, whenever you're able to crack this card for drawing 2 cards, you might actually draw some Convokes, and you're able to play multiple spells in a turn because you won't necessarily need the mana. Flower and Flourish. This card gets a C. Flower is search your library for a forest or plains, reveal it and put it in your hand. So this is for consistency. It's a hybrid mana, so that's really decent. And then for 6 mana, you give your creatures +2/+2 until the end of turn. That goes well with your Guild Mage to give them trample and then give them a pump. The card's not incredibly amazing because for 6 mana, getting a pump but without it having trample additionally isn't amazing. The flower aspect's good as far as making sure that if you have not a great hand, you're able to find that land so you don't miss a land drop. But neither side is exactly what I want to see out of a mana fixing spell. I'd love to pay 2 or 3 and get a land into play. Flourish, I would love to see it have trample. So it's parts of cards I like in limited, but it's not all of a card I like in limited. Camaraderie is a 6 mana sorcery. It's basically Selesnya's Sphinx's Revelation. You gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures you control, and your creatures get +1/+1 until the end of turn. So it's going to be really easy to have a 5, 6, 7 board state of creatures. So it's 6 mana. You could potentially draw 7 or more cards, gain that much life, and they all get a little bit bigger to have one really big attack. So I think this card's going to be really efficient and limited. It's going to be an A- for me because I think this card is going to really catch opponents off guard and it's going to get you a lot of value to win the game overall. Join Shields is 3 green and a white. It's an instant. Untap all creatures you control. They gain hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. This card is going to be really important because, as we've already talked about, we have Convoke in the Selesnya guild. So you're going to be tapping a lot of your creatures on your turn to cast spells early. So your opponents are going to be trying to pressure you when you're convoking. So if you have 5 mana open and you convoke a bunch of things, now we have to start watching out for the Selesnya opponent having this card to convoke, play something large. They attack into the board state and then untap everything and give them indestructible and get free blocks. So this card is a C+. It's going to set up some blowouts, especially in your first weekend with the pre-release. But as this set goes on, you want to definitely watch out for whenever your Selesnya opponent has 5 mana open. Night of Autumn is a 1 green white 2/1. When it comes into play, you get to choose to put 2 counters on it, destroy a target or a target artifact or enchantment, or you gain 4 life. So you get 3 modal effects. The gaining life and the destroying the artifact or enchantment aren't super important in Guilds of Ravnica Limited. But being able to play a 3-drop 4/3 is pretty decent, and the fact it has the other options against like white enchantment removal is pretty nice. I give the card a C+ because it's not exactly amazing. It's going to be a lot more of a constructed player than a limited player, but you still are happy to see it in your pool. Sprouting Renewal is 2 and a green, and it has Convoke. You can either make a 2/2 green-white knight elf token with Vigilance, or you can destroy an artifact or enchantment. I also give this card a C+. It's not as good in a vacuum as the knight from the previous card, but this card having Convoke means it's also potentially a free spell. So you could just make a free 2/2 by tapping some creatures you have, or you can blow up another effect, and you're able to play multiple spells in a turn faster, which is really how you get ahead in limited. Venerated Lockstone is actually one of the cards I'm most excited for Constructed. It's 4 and a white. It has Convoke. It's a 4/4 Elephant Cleric. And when it comes into play, each creature that was used to convoke it gets a +1/+1 counter. So you really ideally want to tap 0 lands for this card. You really want to tap 5 creatures. So this card comes into play as a 4/4, gives 5 other creatures a 1/1 counter. So really it's 5 mana or tapping 5 creatures for 9 power. So in the long game, that's going to really help you take over and pressure your opponent. And at a regular rare, it could be conceivable for you to get 1 or 2 of these in a draft or in a seal pool, but even one of them is going to really push your deck over the top. I give it an A- just because of the effect and the fact that you can play it fairly early, and it's really going to throw off your opponent's board states whenever you put 9 power into play on turn 3 or 4. Arboretum Elemental is another Convoke creature. It's a 7 and 2 green for a 7/5, and it has Hexproof. So this creature is a pretty strong threat. It's really hard for your opponents to interact with it. They have to be able to block and trade with it. So if you have any pump spells, this card gets better. And the Convoke aspect's really nice. But for 9 mana, that means you're tapping some mana and some of your creatures. Otherwise, you're leaving yourself completely defenseless if you tap all your creatures. I give the card a C+ because I want to see 1 or 2 of them in my pool if I don't get a big, rare threat. This is a decent replacement, but I don't want to run more than maybe 1 of it. Conclave Tribunal is a new version of Oblivion Ring. It's the 3 and a white enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent until this leaves the battlefield, but it also has Convoke. So you can actually play some cards, advance your board state, and then play this card on the same turn. It gets a B+ because it's just solid removal. It's probably one of the best removal spells in the Selesnya tribe. Flight of the Equinaughts are 7 and a white for a human knight. It has Convoke. It's a 4/5 with flying. So you can tap 8 creatures to play this for free, or a combination of creatures and mana. I think the card is a C+, just because you're going to make the board state really muddy, and you're going to stress the board out a lot. So by being able to play this card early, you're going to be able to have your blockers. You'll be able to make it really hard for your opponent to attack. And if they don't have flyers or answers to flyers, you can just chop for 4 in the air, and this is going to really pressure your opponent quickly. Ledev Champion is 1 and a green and a white. And it's a 2/2. When it attacks, you can tap any number of untapped creatures you control. This gets a +1/+1 until the end of turn for each creature you tapped. You can also pay 5 mana to create the 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. I'm not as big of a fan on this card just because it's not that I can tap it anytime it's in combat. I have to tap it when it's attacking. So I don't have a choice to let my opponents declare the blockers, then decide how much to tap. So I give it a C. It's decent because it's also nice to have that mana sink later in the game when you're convoking your creatures to play spells, using your mana to activate abilities to really just expand your board state, but it's also not incredibly impressive. World Soul Colossus is a card that I think is going to be very matchup dependent. If they don't have a lot of unconditional removal, if it's a lot of red-based removal spells or combat damage, this card gets a lot better. So it's an X, a green, and a white with Convoke, and enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter for each X you paid. So that means you can use mana and you can tap your creatures to make this one really large threat. I give it a C because it's one I want to see one of them in my pool because I can make it a 7/7 and 8/8 really easily. But if I'm playing against white opponents or unconditional removal and some black decks, it's going to be really poor. Centaur Peacemaker is 1, a green, and a white. It's a 3/3 that when it enters the battlefield, each player gains 4 life. This card is a C+ because really this deck wants to win in the long game. It wants to stall the board state out. So being able to gain 4 life, I don't care if my opponent gains that life. It's really about keeping me alive. And I'm getting a Hill Giant for 3 mana. Ledev Guardian is a 3 and a white for a 2/4 and it has Convoke. I give this card a C. I would like to see a little bit more stats or some kind of keyword, even if it's just a vigilance effect or a lifelink or anything along the lines. But still, 4 mana for a 2/4 with Convoke. I mean, it's a free 2/4, which is pretty decent, but I'm going to end up tapping some of my creatures or losing some of my mana. So I'm not incredibly excited, but it'll probably make it in most of my decks. Lockstone Restorer is 4 and a white. It has Convoke. It's a 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. I think this one's a C- because for 6, whether I'm convoking or tapping mana, getting a 3/4 is not incredibly impressive. And gaining 4 life is decent, but I really don't want to be getting a body for this just for 4 life and 6 tapped mana or creatures. So I give it a C-. It'll end up in a lot of my decks, but I'm also not incredibly excited about having it. Pax Favor is a Convoke pump spell. It is 2 and a green for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 until the end of turn. I think this card's a C+ because it's really common for the aggressive green deck to attack with one fairly large creature. And then the opponent stack a bunch of blocks, and all the creatures that didn't attack are now able to be tapped to produce extra power and toughness to the one creature you attacked with. So when you're playing against Selesnya, they have 3 creatures open and a card in hand. You have to be worried about whether or not they can give their creature +3/+3 when you try to block it. Pause for Reflection is 2 and a green for an instant. It's a fog, prevent all combat damage with Convoke. I don't think this one's going to see limited play very much, so I'd give it an F. Rosemane Centaur, I wasn't a big fan of this card at first, but it's grown on me as a 3, a green, and a white. It's a 4/4 with Vigilance, and it has Convoke. The reason I like this card so much is Vigilance is really important when you have Convoke spells in your deck. Traditionally, Vigilance is decent and limited, but it's extremely important if you have Convoke and you have any pump spells, because now I attack, my opponent can't really block, because if I have a pump spell, I can blow them out. And then in the second main phase, I can tap this creature towards advancing my board state even further. So Vigilance is really strong. I give this card a B- because it's the kind of card I want to see in my pool. I can play it for really cheap, and then I can use it to play other things. Siege Worm is another reprint. It's a 5, a green, and a green. This one has Trample, and it has Convoke, so it's just a generic 5/5 with trample that I can cheat into play for 5 or 4 mana. I give it a B- just because of the speed in which I can cheat this threat in. There's certain decks like Izzet and Boros that this card is massive against. And then there's other decks like Golgari where they can get equal sized and it's not as great. Samala the Woodshaper is 2, a green and a white for a 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can reveal a creature and enchantment card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. I think this card's a B+ because it gives you some contribution towards convoking, but it also gives you some very needed card advantage. So I think this card's amazing. Vernati Shieldmate is 1 and a hybrid green or white. So that means you can actually end up running this in Boros decks. You can run this in Golgari decks because it has that hybrid mana. And it's a 2/2 with Vigilance. Again, like I said earlier, Vigilance is really important to me when I'm playing a Selesnya deck. I want to be able to pressure my opponent early and then use my second main phase to be playing spells at a reduced rate by having all these convokes. So this Vigilance, a keyword, allows me to attack. And I think out of most decks, Selesnya and the concept of Convoke abuses Vigilance more than most other mechanics previously printed. I give this card a C- just because, I mean, it is a Grizzly Bear. It's not as intensive as some of the other Grizzly Bears in the Selesnya set we've seen so far. So it's a card I want to see in my pool. As a 2/2, I'm not going to be attacking with a Vigilance 2/2 super often unless I have pump spells or other effects. But it's a card that I'm happy to have. So I want to see it in my deck. It's just not incredibly impressive. I'd much rather have like a Guild Mage in this place that has a better long game, because that's what I'm trying to get to. Divine Visitation is a card I've been really torn on in Limited. I think it's going to be really good in Constructed with things like Legion's Landing and Sprout Swarming. You can make a bunch of 4/4s and you can ramp this out fairly quickly. And you have a lot of ways. My dream is Legion's Landing with this card out. Means at the end of your turn, I can just pay 3, tap the flipped Legion's Landing and make a free 4/4. And I think that's really good over the long game. In Limited, Selesnya has a fair amount of cards that say create a token, but a lot of them are either mana intensive, such as abilities from creatures, or they have requirements like a creature dies and it makes a token. Not a lot of spells that make tokens outside of the rare and mythic range. So I give this card a C-. It can be a B or an A if your deck ends up really getting a bunch of token producers. But if you're not high in the token producing section, you need to really count how many you have and shave this card out. If I don't have a fair amount of, I would say, 5 to 7 consistent token producers, I really don't want this card, because I need to get at least 2 angels for me to consider it worthwhile to spend the 5 mana on this card to do nothing for a turn. Dawn of Hope is one of our rare token producers, but it's also a little bit difficult to work with. It's 1 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever you gain life, you may pay 2 mana, and if you do, you draw a card. So gaining life is not something we've seen a lot of in most of the cards in the set. There's not a lot of cards that say gain life. There are a few, such as our Convoke creature or the 3/3 that gain 4 life for each side. But the problem with that is you have to have the extra mana to pay for the 2 here. The way it can activate itself is we've seen a few 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink, and this has the ability to pay 4 mana and create one of those. So because you're trying to Convoke, this card might be something you really want. It really depends on how good of a long game your deck has and how much Convoke you're running. I think it's a D as a face value, but it's a card where certain pools are really going to want it, and other pools that don't make a lot of soldiers with lifelink aren't going to have much interest in it. The 10th District Guard is another Grizzly Bear. It's a 1 and a white for a 2/2. When it comes into play, target creature gets +0/+1 until the end of turn. I give this card a C-. It could even be in the D range. Grizzly Bears in the last couple of years have really improved as far as getting text in their text boxes instead of just being 2-drop 2/2s. So really, I want more out of my Grizzly Bear than just giving another creature 1 extra toughness. It could be really important in certain stages of the game, but a lot of times you're going to play it as a 2-drop 2/2, and it's just going to be all you do. Now, if you need this in Selesnya for your curve, because you want to make sure you're Convoking, so you don't want to have turns in the early stages of the game where you're not playing a creature, but ideally you would much rather have a better Grizzly Bear. Sworn Companions is 2 and a white. For it's kind of a raise the alarm effect. It's a sorcery. You get 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. So we talked earlier with the Angel enchantment that we don't have a lot of lower costed, lower rarity token producers. This is one of them that makes you want to run that Angel enchantment. I give this card a C+. The white soldiers, we're getting 2 creatures. They produce 2 mana towards Convoking. I can play multiple spells in the turn faster. They have lifelink, so they trigger certain other effects, and I have a few ways to pump them. So it's the ability just to go wide, slow the game down, and then get some extra effects later. Hunted Witness, it's a return of a version of Doom Traveler. Doom Traveler used to be a 1-drop that when it died, you got a 1/1 flyer, and it was a 1/1 itself. This is a 1-drop 1/1 that when it dies, you get a 1/1 white soldier with lifelink. I give this card a C-. In Constructed, I think this card's going to be very Thraben Inspector Doom Traveler-like. You're going to see this in a lot of decks. In Limited, it's a card that you really want. It's very important. It produces 2 bodies for your deck, so you're able to chump block and the next turn Convoke. But at the same time, it's also not going to be a very good draw after turn 3 because it's going to be really hard to get much value out of it. So it's one of the cards that you're probably going to run, but it's one of your earlier cuts if you have a pretty good early game. Candlelight Vigil is a 3 and a white enchantment aura, where the enchanted creature gets +3/+2 and has Vigilance. I give this card a D. As much as I like Vigilance, I really don't want a 2-for-1 myself if my opponent has a removal spell, just because I want to give a creature Vigilance. And I would much rather give a little bit more toughness than power, so I have the ability to attack into a board stall and use the Vigilance more beneficially. So neither side of this card is something I really want to be. Beast Whisperer is a very powerful card. It's 2 and a green. It's a 2/3. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. This card can go in either green deck. It's not watermarked for one or the other. And it doesn't work very well with your tokens, but the fact that every time you cast a creature spell, you draw a card can be really strong, especially when you take into account Convoke. If you are able to stack up enough mana and enough creatures, you could conceivably chain 2 or 3 Convoke creatures together to free draw spells, and you're still establishing a board. Also worth noting, it is a green creature itself, so it can be used as a Convoke towards green or towards colorless. I give this card a B. It's definitely a rare I want to see opened if I'm going to be in Golgari or in Selesnya. It's a card that I can see going either way. Bout of Mighty. This is a 4 green instant. It's a very unique card. Target creature gets +3/+3 until the end of turn. Target creature gets +3/+3 until the end of turn. And target creature gets +3/+3 until the end of turn. Now the reason this is broken up is because I can choose 3 different targets. I can target one creature twice and another creature another time. Or I can just give one creature +9/+9 at instant speed for 6 mana, which is a really good rate. I give this card a B+. It's going to kill a lot of people in your pre-release. If you're playing Selesnya and you make a bunch of tokens and you swing and they don't block 2 or 3 of the tokens, you randomly give one of the tokens +9/+9, they're probably dead or very close to it because the tokens will also already have their base power. So you might turn a 1/1 into a 10/10. And if it's one of the soldiers, it also has lifelink. So now you gain 10 life. So I think this card's really strong. It's also worth noting that you can use it defensively. So your opponent attacks into you, you set up some blocks with your soldiers, you give them all +3/+3, and now you have 3/4/4 soldiers that probably win their combats. This card's pretty strong, and it's a rare you definitely want to open. Pelt Collector. This one also can go in Selesnya or Golgari. A lot of these cards, I'm just kind of picking where I think they'll go. So it's a green 1/1. It's a lot like Experiment 1 from the last Ravnica block from the Simic Guild. Whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield or dies, if that creature's power is greater than Pelt Collector, put a +1/+1 counter on Pelt Collector. As long as Pelt Collector has 3 or more +1/+1 counters on it, it has Trample. So it turns into a, once it's a 4/4, it starts trampling. I think this card's amazing and constructed, definitely, and limited, also fairly strong. Because the difference between Experiment 1 is Experiment 1 is whenever another creature entered the battlefield. This one is entering and another creature dying. So if I draw this card later and my creatures start dying, this 1/1 slowly levels up as my larger creatures that were already in play die, and levels up as I play other larger creatures. So I give this card a C+. It is conditional. It is a little situational. There are board states where I'm not going to want it. I don't love it as a top deck. It's not dead, but I don't love it as a top deck. But it's not quite a B range. It's just a really decent early play, especially if you have a lot of Convoke spells. Getting a 1-drop like this is something you're really excited to see. So this is Circuitous Route. Previously it was spoiled as a card called Detour. And it is a sorcery, 3 and a green. And it's so that you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards and or gate cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Then shuffle your library. This card for me is a C+. I think it's going to make massive waves in Standard. Explosive Vegetation has before. I think this will as well. The Explosive Vegetation will search your library for 2 forests. So you can get shock lands. So you can get a green and another shock land. But everything was tied to green. By being able to search your gates, this really opens you up to being able to pull a red-white land, a blue-black land, or a blue-red land. So in Constructed, it's going to be a lot of value for any 4 or 5 color decks. If we see 4 or 5 color mid-range, controls, Nexus of Fate combo lists, this is going to be a very key component of that. In Limited, I think in Sealed, it's going to be still very good for 6 mana. For 4 mana, I get to go up to 6 lands. I get to fix my colors. That's going to be great. But in Draft, I think if we see any Draft 3, 4, 5 color draft good stuff lists, this is going to be a key component. So I think this card is really great in Limited. In Draft, it's going to do a lot of great things unless we have really aggressive Boros lists. So it's really going to be kind of meta dependent. And in Sealed, it's going to be very efficient what it does. I think it's going to make its biggest impact in Constructed. Affectionate Indrik, which is probably one of my favorite card arts, is a 5 colorless mana and a green. So it's a 6-drop 4/4, which isn't amazing. but when it enters the battlefield, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. So this is a really efficient card at just coming in and fighting a 3/3. You can trade it for something bigger. You can fight for a 2/2, fight a token. But it's just really a creature that comes into play that swings the board state. And these effects have always been good. Fight on a creature has always been a really strong effect in Limited. So I give this card a B-. I think the card's one you want to see in your pool for sure. I wouldn't be afraid to run 2 of it, just because the effect of being able to remove a creature from their board and put one on my own is always really effective. Might of the Masses is a green. Target creature gets +1/+1 until the end of turn for each creature you control. I give this a C-. I've never really cared much for effects that are dependent on my board state, because then if my opponent has any reactions, I'm not actually getting what I was expecting to get out of it. And if my board state's been ravished and I just have one creature in play, it's 1 mana for +1/+1. So it's not something I'm incredibly excited to have, but if I need pump spells, this could be a card I run. District Guide, this is another card that I think could see constructed play, but also definitely a limited as far as sealed. It's going to make your deck very consistent, and in draft, it's going to be a chase card if we have 4 and 5 color decks floating around. It's a 2 and a green for a 2/2. When it comes into play, you can search your library for a basic land or a gate card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So again, this will allow you to fix off colors, splash colors. It's going to play a lot like Skittering Surveyor, but the difference between this and Skittering Surveyor is that this card is a 2/2, and it will actually let you go fetch a dual land of your other splashed colors and put that into play. So I think this card's a great card for Limited. It's a C+. Crushing Canopy is 2 and a green. We've seen this one before. Destroy a creature with flying or target enchantment. I give it an F, not because you won't play it. You might sideboard it in against some of the white lists, the red-white lists, but it's not a card that I'm incredibly excited to have. It's just a necessary sideboard card. Devkarian Dissident is a Grizzly Bear. It's a 1 and a green for a 2/2. I give it a C. It's a 5 mana effect that gives you +2/+2 until the end of turn. I think it's decent, but again, out of my Grizzly Bears, waiting till turn 5 for them to do anything special, I'm not the biggest fan of if they're just generic until that point. Generous Stray, another one of my favorite card arts, is a 2 and a green. It's a 1/2 cat. So all of our cat stuff, for the most part, is rotating out, which is a little disappointing, but it's still a 3-drop, 1/2 cat, and when it comes into play, you draw a card. This card's a D+, and it's really an important asterisk. If your pool has a lot of Convokes in it, this is a card you want in your deck. If your pool doesn't have a lot of Convokes in it, this is not a card you want in your deck. You want it to be able to produce on multiple angles. So if you have 4, 5, 6 cards that are Convoking in your deck, now this card is a card that replaces itself and basically taps for conditional mana. So that's really important. It also allows you to chump block, maintain that wider board state. But 3 mana for a 1/2 is not incredibly impressive. If I'm running a lot of Convokes, I'm all about running at least 1 or 2 of this card. Grappling Sundew is a 1 and a green. It's a 0/4 Defender and Reach. This is not a card I'm very impressed with. It's 4 and a green. It gets indestructible until the end of turn. I really don't want to be paying 5 mana, so my blocker that doesn't do anything can continue to sit there and do nothing. So this is not a card I'm really impressed with, although Selesnya, as we saw, didn't have a whole lot of removal effects. There are some other white cards I put in the Boros review that could go into this list, but overall, it doesn't have a lot of removal, so this might be a necessary card to play, but I'm really not interested in paying 5 mana to basically lock down one card. So I give this card an F. Iron Shell Beetle is 1 and a green. When it comes into play, you get to put a 1/1 counter on target creature. It is itself a 1/1. So really, you evaluate this card as a Grizzly Bear, but it's able to move one of its powers elsewhere. I think this card's really efficient. In the early stages, I can play this as just a 2-drop, 2/2 Grizzly Bear to stop some of my opponent's attacks. In the later stages, I play as a 2-drop, 1/1 that makes one of my bigger threats even more threatening, or like a flyer, and it is able to produce for Convoking. So I think this card's going to be really key in good Selesnya lists. It's going to be a C+ for me. If I'm drafting, I want to draft multiple of this card if I'm in Selesnya, because I want to take every good Convoke threat I can find and then run cards like this that have meaningful impacts and then produce towards my Convokes. Urban Utopia is 1 and a green. You enchant a land. When it comes into play, you draw a card, and it taps for 1 mana of any color. Again, if there's 4 or 5 color lists, if you're running low on our Search Your Library for 2 lands, if you're running low on our District Guides, this card's something you can run to fix your splashes. But because it's not actually advanced, it doesn't actually advance your mana. You're basically spending 2 mana to draw a card and fix your mana starting the next turn. It's not incredibly exciting. I give it a D-. I'm sure in draft there's going to be some very greedy lists that are going to want this. I will definitely play some sealed events where I'm very greedy and I'm forced 4 colors for fun, and this might be a card I run. But in a traditional pre-release, this is not a card you're probably going to put in your deck. Wary Okapi is a 2 and a green. It's a 3/2 Antelope with Vigilance. Normally, I'm not a huge fan of 3-drop 3/2s that don't have meaningful impacts on the board state, but again, this does have Vigilance. So if I have pump spells in my deck and I'm able to attack and see if they're going to block and maybe use a pump spell as a removal spell, or attack and they don't block because they're afraid of the pump spell, then use this for Convoking. Again, Vigilance is an effect that I like to see. I give it a C. It could be a card that you cut if you're heavy in 3-drops, but if you are low in your 3-drops, again, I said earlier, you want to have a really good curve. This is a card you might run. Now, while we're talking about curve, it's really important to remember in Selesnya, cheating your curve and having a few more 2-drops and having a little bit of lower curve is not a bad thing for Selesnya if your Convoke level's higher. Normally, you want to use all your mana every turn, but if you have a decent number of cards that say Convoke, running 2/2/2s instead of running a decent distribution of 2s and 3s isn't necessarily the worst. Wild Ceratok is 3 and a green for a 4/3 Rhino. It has no text besides flavor text. This card's not a card I'm interested in playing. It trades down most of the time. We have a lot of 3-powered creatures that are at a lower CMC. We don't have a lot of ways to leverage this card. It's coming in too late to really contribute to Convoking. So it's not a card I really want to run. Again, if I'm trying to fix my curve, possibly. But in my personal stance, I would much rather play a 2-drop within my colors than this 4-drop, because my 2-drop means I can play 2 Grizzly Bears in a turn and use them for Convoking faster. So I'm not super interested in this card. I give it a D-. It could be just an F, not a card I really want to. Well, that is it for Selesnya. What do you think about all the Selesnya cards? So far, we've seen Boros and Selesnya. Which guild do you think that you're going to want to go with? What cards are really impressing you and pulling you towards one of those guilds? And which guilds are you excited to learn more about? As always, make sure that you give us a like and a subscribe for Twitter and for YouTube. We'll get notifications every time we post our set reviews. We still have Golgari, Izzet, and Dimir coming up, as well as the artifacts, lands, and we'll provide you an overall view of what the limited environment looks like for Guilds of Ravnica, talking about some of the rarity of the removal spells, and I'll do an average run of the rankings I gave all the cards to give you an average quick snapshot if you're not at all prepared of which guild you might want to go with. Also, let us know below if there's decks that you want to see streamed, or if there's brews that you're working on with the new Guilds of Ravnica set. I know that's one part I'm really excited about. So if you want to see certain lists when the new set drops out as standard, or if you see some cards you think are going to be shaking up Modern, definitely let us know below.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. It helps out a lot. Also, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with all of our uploads. You can follow us on these platforms here at MTG Deck Techs. And finally, a big shout out to Terry Ledford for his generous Patreon donation. If you would like to become a patron for MTG Deck Techs, please click the link down below. It is not necessary, but it helps us out quite a bit. Thank you for watching the video, and we will see you all again soon.